back live with Andrew Bolt with the Bolt Report.
We have for most of our modern history been a country of mass immigration. My own parents, immigrants in the great post-war rush. Recently, immigration has reached, though, absolutely amazing levels. Under Labor, it was as high as 300,000 more immigrants a year, net. But that means, of course, crowded cities, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, crowded roads and trains and schools. And it also means, sadly, more crime from some ethnic groups, others, of course, very law-abiding. Some of the ethnic groups we've been importing. Now, the reason we accept all that part of the deal is because business groups and politicians keep telling us that at least high immigration makes us richer. But is that true? Compare Australia running a huge immigration program against countries that are actually losing populations instead. There's Portugal and Japan, of course, with a very small immigration policy, Hungary, Germany and Estonia. But now see how Australians aren't actually getting much richer compared to those countries, not when you look at per head of population. Joining me earlier was Leith van Onselen, an economist who has worked for the Australian and Victorian Treasuries and is now co-founder of macrobusiness.com.au. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, look, you've done some fascinating work on the economics of mass immigration that I'd like to go through, but let's start from the basics. First, how high is our current level of immigration?
Well, the thing that sets immigration is the permanent migrant intake, and that's currently set at 200,000 people a year, which is almost 2.5 times the historical average from Federation to the year 2000.
I don't know, but when you say something like that, what is that? That's like a Canberra every 3 or 4 years? 4 years?
Well, there's two ways that migration impacts population growth. First of all is directly. Obviously, people who come, get off the plane, add to population growth straight away. At the same time, migrants also have children. So over the long term, you get a double impact. You get the impact, first of all, from the migrants and then from the children of migrants.
But this is the thing, when you say that, right? Now, it's like building in Adelaide every 5 years. I look around, I don't see the infrastructure going in that will sustain that kind of level of mass immigration into this country.
Yeah, well, I mean, you only have to look at Melbourne. Melbourne's added 1 million people in 12 years. According to the latest census, it added 480,000 people in just 5 years. And the projections are for Melbourne to add 97,000 people per year, 1,870 people per week for the next 35 years, adding 2.5 Adelaides to the city's population. It's just nuts.
But if you're living in a city like Melbourne, and Sydney's had the same sort of problem, I think Brisbane less so, but it's getting there too. You're asking people then, or the politicians are asking people to accept, obviously, more crowded roads, more crowded schools, more crowded railways, just jam-packed. And then when you go a weekend in the country, there are 10 cars where there used to be 5. Why would we do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the politicians like to keep the immigration floodgates on because it basically juices the economy. It gives the perception of growth. So obviously more inputs in people means more outputs in economic activity. It means more construction, right, more mortgages to sell to banks, more retail sales. But you've got to measure it on a per-person basis.
I agree completely. I think a great fraud has been perpetrated on us that's become more obvious over the last decade. Now, this is where your research is most interesting, obviously, as an economist. The traditional claim by big business, which is a big driver of this, and by politicians is it makes us richer. Before it used to also be makes us stronger against the communist menace and all that kind of stuff, but now it's about making us richer. The traditional measure has been in total economic output. But you're saying, and I think you're right, we as citizens want to know how it makes each of us better, poorer or worse. What's the evidence here?
Well, there isn't a lot of evidence. Immigration, if you double the population, you can roughly double the growth. But per person, you're not actually making yourself richer. And once you factor in other factors like environmental degradation, spending more time stuck in traffic, being crush-loaded onto a train, not being able to afford a house or only being able to afford a small house, it actually can make incumbent residents worse off. And the other issue which economists often forget is that Australia pays its way in the world by selling its fixed endowments of resources. And if you bring in a whole bunch more people, you're devaluing the value of those resources per head. And it means you've got to sell off your resources quicker to maintain a constant standard of living. So it's actually quite self-defeating.
All right, well, in your latest post on macrobusiness.com.au, you had a really interesting graphic where you've disaggregated the various population growths, mainly immigration-driven, obviously, between the various states. Far and away, Victoria has got the fastest population growth. Conventional excuse-making for mass immigration would be, and therefore Victoria then gets richer. What's the evidence that you've found?
Well, it is true. Victoria has led the jobs growth in the last year. We've also had fairly strong economic growth. But again, if you break it down to that per-person measure, Victoria per person has had effectively no economic growth since the global financial crisis. Our unemployment rate is higher than the rest of the nation. It's actually increased in the last year. So really, Victoria is just spinning the tyres. It's wrecking the infrastructure engine, and we're not going anywhere.
So you're getting a lot more crowded city, because most of it comes into Melbourne and Dandenong. A crowded city, crowded infrastructure, less amenity. We've also got higher ethnic crime rates, obviously, that Melbourne's seen to its astonishment. But you're saying we're not actually getting richer per person, which is where it counts.
Absolutely. The evidence shows unequivocally that Victoria has not boosted its per person.
All right. An anomaly. Okay, let's say it's an anomaly. I think New South Wales is the second fastest growing state. What's the evidence there then?
New South Wales has performed a little bit better than Victoria, but it still, again, has had very poor economic growth since the financial crisis. And in fact, Australia-wide, Australia's per capita GDP growth has been falling for the past 15 years. The growth rate, in fact, if you annualise the 10 years average growth in per person GDP, it's running at lower levels than the 1983 and early 90s recession.
You see, now this is what I think is actually driving a lot of the political discontent that's really destroying the governments, first Labor and now here. People aren't feeling like they're getting ahead. And I suspect there is a link, obviously it's not the whole story, but a link between mass immigration, this perception of growth, and people puzzled as to why their own incomes aren't increasing.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, you only have to look at the political process. We have one-term governments now are quite common, whereas they used to not be. At the state level, we saw the Brumby government get rolled in public transport because public transport wasn't keeping up with population growth. We saw the Napthine government get rolled after one term, again for the same issues. And now we've got the current Victorian government under immense pressure because, again, infrastructure and livability is not keeping up with the rising population growth. It's a little bit like trying to steer a car through witches' hats. If your population's growing slowly, you can do that and you can solve the problems of the electorate. But if you're growing too fast, you drive too fast and you knock some of those witches' hats over. It's that simple.
Yeah, but the extraordinary thing is that immigration barely registers a mention in the political debate, apart from, say, Pauline Hanson and now Tony Abbott. But it's like it's got lots of warning signs. You don't get involved. It's about racism and this, etc. And so we don't discuss what's actually quite central to people's standard of life. Now, you've mentioned the Victorian case, and we've shown the stats, the New South Wales example. Let's cast overseas. Japan has gone a very different way, a radically different way from Australia. We've said high immigration is our future. Japan has said almost no immigration into Japan. They want cultural cohesion. They value that more than anything. Their population has rapidly aged, and the headline has been Japan has been a country of stagnation for 30 years. Can you tell us, when we look at the real measure of growth, which is per person, whether per person you're getting better off, how does Japan's growth stack up to ours?
It's a little bit less than ours per capita, but not by much. And when you factor in that Japan wouldn't be spending a share of their growth on building up infrastructure and that kind of thing to keep up with population growth, who knows, they might be better off. And there are other measures too. Japan's unemployment rate's about 3%. It's well below ours. And the way Japan's dealing with population ageing is not by trying to bring in a whole bunch of people. They're dealing with it via automation and doing it in a clever way. And Australia should be looking more down that route. Now, I'm not saying we should, stop all immigration, but instead of growing by 1 million people every 2.5 years, why not grow by 1 million people every 7 years? That's still a very generous migrant intake, and it brings us back to the level that existed for about 100 years between Federation and the year 2000, before it was massively increased. It seems like a very, very sensible compromise to take the strain off cities, livability, housing affordability, infrastructure, all those sorts of things. And we can still be a generous migrant country like we always were. We just have to slow down a little bit. It's not rocket science.
Leith and Onselen, thank you so much for your time. This is such an important issue. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.